through this lecture, we will be in a position to understand how to undertake any of our interventions, particularly from either in the child protection area or also possibly from the domestic violence centers themselves. Um, I'm hoping that the PowerPoint presentation will also appear alongside the way I present. So some of the thoughts that I have for today are that domestic violence and child maltreatment have, in a way, have been widely identified as sort of co-occurring social phenomena. In other words, both coexist, and we have had enough evidence to suggest that um, children obviously get to see what's happening in the family, and if one partner is abused or if one partner is violated, automatically children tend to see what is happening, and it has tremendous effect um, on their future. We are also kind of aware that and informed through our practice as well as through research, the children living in an environment of domestic violence are at significant risk. And what those risks are, we've seen them. They could be behavioral. It could be that they experience violence themselves and often left or neglected due to their parents' capacities. We know that their parents obviously um, reduce their caregiving capacity as a result of preoccupation with their own self and issues concerning their relationship. So, how do we go about addressing the clients who present these concerns? And what is it that intervention responses must look at? I think, firstly, it's important that we understand that there are overlapping concerns in relation to domestic violence and child protection. And significantly, there are also societal concerns because, from the perspective of the family, the from the perspective of the family, from the perspective of society, there are many impending issues that we need to think about. Now, if we are thinking in terms of programs that we wish to organize, what is it that we need to base it on? Should the program be individualized? Should there be a situation where some of the clients can be brought together from the perspective of doing some group work with them? And how do we put a whole lot of people together? And particularly when we have to also make those ethical decisions around and also remain non-judgmental from the perspective of the key worker. So what is the opportunity that we provide for the individuals to work through the program? How do we let them reflect? Is there an opportunity for them to reflect in a group situation? Ultimately, have they actually made a resolution to reflect? So it's very important in the initial stages itself that we provide such opportunities for people that are considering wanting to succeed as a good parent. And those resolutions obviously need to be in the best interest of the children. I guess when we set up these groups, we need to see in those groups that individuals make those resolutions, particularly to bring forward some behavioral changes And they also begin to resource themselves in terms of making decisions, making resolutions, holding on to them, and keeping themselves abreast with whatever is happening otherwise, and notice at some point of time that changes can occur in their behavior. And how do we set these things up? Addressing issues and concerns through well-designed supportive group work processes. Certainly, we all believe that apart from individual counseling, groups help. But how do we ensure that the group processes are obviously helping them? And how do we ensure that there is some kind of a evaluation that is taking place from the parents themselves to see that some changes are occurring as a result of those groups? Are parents very clear in terms of addressing the violence and abuse, particularly towards each partner? Is that an issue with child protection? Abuse related to children, which is actually becoming an issue between the partners. Those are the kind of things that we need to be thinking about. I also feel it's important to address both child protection issues and domestic violence issues in a simultaneous way at the same time. Because what is Child Protection Department concerned itself with? Child Protection Department wants to ensure safety of the child. And the services that we have got for domestic violence want to ensure that families are caring, families respect, the respect towards each of the genders' contribution to the family is respected. So that is important then to consider that the overlap between child protection and domestic violence issues need obviously to be handled in a way that we are in a position to take forward some measures. Now, research since the 1990s seems to suggest that there is a co-occurrence of domestic violence and child maltreatment of domestic violence. As I said, they do go hand in hand. Within Australia, the rates of co-occurrence may be differing from time to time, but the growing body of literature tells us that the programs also need to be correlated, and therefore we need to be prepared towards a response that addresses things together. I have noticed in my work in the Child Protection Department, when I worked I worked right from at the grassroots in the initial stages as a family support officer or child protection worker, and then later as a team leader and some other time as an area management person. I've noticed that the younger age group, relatively younger age group with which um, with which people enter into child protection possibly may feel comfort in programs that are designed to deal with children, and of course they are trained within the department on also aspects of domestic violence, recognition of domestic violence. They can recognize that, but they feel their comfort zone is with children, alternate care, and they also seem to be okay with some of the tasks, the core tasks of liaising with children alone. With certainly with when domestic violence interfaces in their work, they would require some support. So in other words, in some child safety centers, there's always been an opportunity for a younger worker to be buddied with a slightly elderly worker within the department who has a different outlook altogether. In other words, one is geared towards looking after recreational and the fun part of the children's activities, and through that, of course, build them up, build their resilience, and build their coping. While the elderly worker, or a slightly more mature worker, tends to look at how to present um, issues and how to tease issues from with the partners or with the parents themselves. Now, I recognize also that child protection department by itself does not go ahead and ask people, they recommend the services which are available, and they also do the referrals to the domestic violence centers which are available in the non-governmental auspice, and that's the only way that we can basically help people in the whole process. But I think the communication and communication of issues is very, very important between the two, and a clear understanding of the goals at the end of the day. What are the goals that we have got? um, I have noticed that there is sometimes a bit of a tension between the goals which are set in a way for domestic violence and the goals that we otherwise set for child protection. When I say that, I want to word myself with a bit of a caution. In child protection, child safety is supreme, right? So what happens is there is a kind of a zero tolerance orientation that we have in terms of any kind of domestic violence that has occurred in the past, and we would like to see that it actually we do not wish to see that children are returned to an environment where the domestic violence is somehow latently pursued by the I mean latently, it's available there, it can be seen there, and maybe there is a possibility that once in a while there can be a flare up. So working with domestic violence and working with child safety concerns means it's almost like riding two horses at the same time, which is of course a very, very difficult thing. It's an impossible act, but what needs to be understood in the whole process is that we need to be prepared to take a level of risk with the in case once we are assured that both parents are looking forward to working with the department, would like to get the children back, and would also like to get together back into a situation where they were before, then certainly we need to start taking some baby steps, particularly in relation to the risk. And that is something that I would always recommend people to think about. Enough literature that claims that in the realm of highly gendered nature of domestic violence, victimization affects women's mental health and certainly their ability to be sensitive and a responsive parent. So what we are talking about in this is um, you don't expect woman who has been battered, living with a batterer, living in a violent situation, still sorting out issues, not to be moody at all, should get up with the bruised face and still pack lunches for the children and take them to the school and remain active as far as children's activities are concerned. That is not really possible. So the victimization does affect the mental health, does affect her poise, her self-esteem. And I think one needs to think and give uh, a big margin towards that. So when there are sometimes people say that, look, um, they are going towards separation, and all we need to do is we need to work towards access arrangements and other things, which the system will tell us, the courts tell us, and courts tell us on the basis of what the lawyers possibly ask for. And it's generally at that point of time, it is a mitigated response rather than a mitigated response or a mediated response by the parents rather than a well thought out response to the situation. So it's not, when I use the word well thought out by the parents themselves. So they are obviously have their own power to make decisions, but in the the empowering process, particularly in the court related matters, is something that is obviously beyond the scope of social work. And maybe it is one of those areas that we need to intervene and help parents to when they are responding simultaneously to the court, to the lawyers, and or going through those sorts of processes. They need to be um, there has to be a role for social work to understand, explain, and look towards um, increasing the coping of the partners, ensuring that they do consider how they wish to respond over a period of time to their children, and to also understand that there are significant risks involved with the mental health at that point of time, and that they need supportive counseling. And in case they are not able to make some of those major decisions, they shouldn't be rushed at all. And that's how I feel that we need to be approaching, and therefore there's a need for a social work response both in DV as well as in child protection. Now, literature also suggests to us that there are some interesting facets from the children's perspective. Children seem to come up with, oh, if, as long as there is no violence between parents, um, at least that's, if they don't see it, that's good enough parenting. But from one perspective, maybe yes, it's an unfortunate blessing in disguise that the parents don't fight in front of children, but they are passively aggressive to each other, and there's very little communications among themselves. There is no a responsive parenting, a sensitive parenting, as we have suggested before, um, which is bringing the fun part in the whole relationship with children. I think that needs to be also sorted out, understood. So literature tries to see that as children's perceptions of their parents' care in environments such as domestic violence. That is, violent fathers are not engaged parents. So that's a very clear indication. So nonviolent mother probably is not, nonviolent mother obviously is not reacting. So therefore she might go ahead with her duties, with her chores, with the everyday battles, drop the children to the school, bring them back, make their lunches, see to it that they go to their music classes, or whatever those things that she is involved with. I've seen one thing that, you know, um, parenting, even if we say men and women are involved in the whole process. Men are needed in everything. Certainly, the weight and the positive voting in relationships and in ensuring looking after children is concerned, I think women obviously play a greater role. And of course, men play a role in parenting. But I have seen in many situations where domestic violence has not been present at all. They're not violent families at all. But there are issues within the family. There are concerns within the family. They deal with those concerns, but also sometimes they don't deal with those concerns and they just brush them off or leave them under the carpet. So in situations like that, you would find one of the parents seem to be more responsive, and that certainly is a weight. It's a gendered parent. It's a mother that obviously plays that very special role. So the perceptions part is interesting. I would not know how you have seen them as far as in your world is concerned in terms of your practice, but I guess that's one of the things that is the research also talks about. Now, how do we go about focusing on the interventions that are related to improving parenting capacity for both mothers and fathers? Certainly, in the world of social work, they always receive clear support to as many parents that want to work with each other. The churches like to do that, religious organizations would like to do that. And the whole concept of holding good families and good communities and the entire thing about the positivity that we would like to ensure that it keeps vibrating in the society is all about ensuring that there is a working, effective working relationship, which is heartful relationship, heart as in HEART. Um, and sometimes people are being respectful to each other. In the previous lectures we have covered how gendered orientation can actually be brought together in relationships, and how early education right in schools itself can build up future parents to be more responsive and certainly more sensitive to each other. So it all starts with sensitivity and responsiveness to each other first, and then, of course, to their children. So there is a perception that we have less support to preventative counseling in the community. I'm not too sure how it is in Darwin, but in other places I felt so. So I've also felt that um, you know, the entire programs that we have seem to be at the tertiary level. In other words, the act of violence has already been committed, whether it is verbal violence, whether it's emotional abuse, whether it is, battering, but it has actually happened. And it's unfortunate that we let those kind of things happen to such an extent and then we come into it. So I do believe that if there is a preventative action, if there are preventative programs available, and they do suggest that the tolerance towards violence is zero in our society and people are able to pick it up, I think things will improve. Things ought to improve if there is enough awareness that help is available. People don't get into a relationship anticipating that there is going to be a violence. People get into relationships um, because they genuinely believe that that is a time for them to enter into a relationship. and that there would be respect, that there would be support, and that each others as partners would support each other. But somehow, when there is a breakdown, communication wise or otherwise, and emotional support start dwindling, and it can either become passive aggressiveness or overt aggressiveness and moves on, then it could become more and more violent. So at the early stages itself, one needs to work with. Now, for what somebody else to work with, in other words, I believe social work does not have to only pick up issues when they reach a peak. Social work obviously has to have that role in building up a community development process of organizing more preventative counseling services just around in the community, which starts saying, oh, should there be a communication issue? Should there be a difference of opinion? How do you resolve it? So it's important that we generate not only awareness about gender and gender issues right in school. Similarly, there has to be, I think, some programs of interest in the community towards parenting. In the early stages itself, towards partnering. Do people know what a relationship would be? What responsibilities would lie in a relationship? Everything is not going to be hunky-dory. So it is that part I think social workers should probably be thinking in terms of how we could start, um, a kind of a relationship counseling prior to people wanting to enter into relationships. It's not that we frighten people. It's just that we need to inform people that there are, just as we expect everything positive, there are also certain things that can happen in a negative way. And we should start building what I always maintain as the differential strength, the coping capacity in everyone to build up and undertake a relationship or any kind of program to its logical end. So that's very, very important for us to think about. Okay, now we of course go back to the tertiary type of issue. When parents separate, risks for severe violence and child neglect abuse exacerbate. Now we know that, and but what is it that we need to be doing? Underestimating the potential for ongoing child abuse after parental separation appears to be a shortcoming in our program responses. I've noticed children come, even child safety department helps out initially in access, transports one child from one parent to the other, and then the child comes back with gifts and talks very enthusiastically about going to McDonald's and going here and there. It all seems to be um, the quality time spent is more, unfortunately, in bribing, in looking after, in trying to make a dig at, I don't think you get this when you're with your mother. Now, it's a different kind of a story that we hear. Unfortunately, with every child that comes back after access, social workers in child protection, social workers in domestic violence don't have time to spend. Our client understanding, our integers, or our pursuit in social work seems to be identifying one person as a client sometimes. And I tend to see in domestic violence and in child protection, it's never one person. There are more than 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people with whom we need to be concerned, and we need to be looking at the relationships issues. I have always seen that we used to do what was called a genogram in the early stages. Of course, I think even now people do genograms in terms of the relationships in the relationships that matter for the child. We draw that genogram. But how often do we actually talk to every member in the genogram? Do we just leave it at that level, that there's a grandmother and we think about the grandmother only if if the child needs to be bumped out from one of those alternate cares and it's not working? What's the role of both the sides maternal people? What is the kind of responsibility that can be put back on the community, on the family, on the relationships that are existing? What is the information that we gain from parents about their own children, who at this point of time are partners and parents to their grandchildren? About their behaviors, about their misdemeanors before. How did they behave when they were young? The narratives, intergenerational narratives, the supportive narratives, these are absent. And when they are absent in our process, they will be absent in our work. And I still believe that's something that we need to rejuvenate and bring forward. I believe that our programs, as I said, needs to have that kind of influence to see where else can we bring forward the integers together. What has been the role, let's say, of mom's friends in the early stages when everything was going well? When was it that mom's friends used to pick up the children from the school and bring them back? Now, what's happening in a different situation at this point of time? What is there? How does, as soon as statutory intervention takes place, should all non-statutory interventions stop? Do we have no role in rejigging those non-statutory relationships? What is it that can be redone? What happens if the statutory interventions that we take don't actually work? Where do we leave them? Some of you who work in child protection know fully well that there are times when children misbehave in alternate homes and we bump them from one place to the other as if it's a movie, from one movie to the other. Some children come back from one home to the other and start saying, in the other house, Mrs. Janice treated me in a different way. Then Mrs. Mumford will say, okay, Mrs. Janice must have, treated you a different way, but I'm not going to treat you any way. I'm going to just give you the same pocket money as I give to my own children. So the question is, in terms of the child's own learned behavior that gets from one alternate home to the other, and then he develops a pattern. At some point of time, we know that once he's 18, once he's, whatever that age is, they go out, they build their relationships, and we do know that there are certain things that seems to be repeating. We've heard before about that kind of cyclical theories about intergenerational violence appearing on the horizon, and what are the roots for that. So I do believe, going back to that particular thought with which I started this particular slide, we need to clearly think about those non-statutory existing relationships or the prior relationships which were there, and we need to rejig them. We need to ensure that there is a role that people played before, and we need to ask them to come back and help. People are people are not shy of helping. People are caring. People want to move away the moment statutory response comes in. People somehow don't want to debate with somebody who is in a statutory type of situation. So it is us who work in the statutory agencies that need to keep up those relationships, need to start talking to these people, need to make that genogram live. And I think that's one of those things that I believe would actually set up a little more positive relationships to help out with the children. Granted that domestic violence has occurred, granted that children have been neglected, abused. I mean, domestic violence itself happening between partners results in child abuse. It tantamounts to child abuse. Its effect at the mental health level is on children. We recognize that. If we recognize that, then we need to ensure not only do we mitigate, reduce, take up baby steps, but support where it is possible. Where it is not possible, I'm not one of those persons who will say, don't do what you do in statutory agencies. Because if I would have said that, I would have never gone from a child support officer to a team leader to somebody for some time in area management or even quality. But I always believe that there are things that you can do creatively, that you need to do those things and not think that everything is to become very, very legalistic and that we need to continue only relying on the legal processes. Now, legal opposition is not illegal. I would prefer a process, not to use oppositional terms, but to use a term like, the normal things which were happening. Legal is solution, but the normative is something that we could probably think about. I'm not, when I'm doing this slides, obviously I haven't asked you questions. Once we finish the slides, I'll ask you some of those questions and take up some answers. But what I'm trying to say at the moment is that we still have an opportunity to try all those creative ventures and build them up. Okay, the next one is about, there's a view that concerns for negative child outcomes. The child is removed by protective services. Yes, of course. That needs to be weighed up simultaneously with the ongoing threat to their safety from remaining in an environment with DV. Now, that's not easy. That's really not easy. In other words, what is a guarantee that a child gets loved and looked after and his or her needs get met, not neglected, not abused, while parents are constantly abusing themselves? I would I would hate to leave a child in that environment. I would only leave a child in that environment provided you are working with the parents through group work, through counseling, ensuring that children are not affected. You are having your own tabs on children, constantly talking to them, assuring them, in a sensitive way that parents are not gagging them not to talk to you, that there is somebody else who's working with the children too, if not you, some other colleague of yours. So that sort of integrated social work, that sort of multi-constituent, multi-stakeholder type of work is what I'm looking forward for you to be working. So that is when I talk about simultaneously keep weighing and also understand the risks that are involved, but do not go necessarily wholeheartedly only supporting a statutory methodology that we seem to be seeing. So the tertiary statutory way of dealing with may not necessarily be the right one, but even if we have done it, if we know that at some point of time we wish to return the child back to the environment, what is the environment to which we want to return him to? Avoid, simply VOID, there's nothing there. He's grown up elsewhere, bumped from one home to the other. At 17, 18, we want him to go back home. What is it that we have built? How did we deal with the others? What is the relationship that we have maintained between the child who came out and the family? These are very, very important. And this field, I can tell you, is a fascinating field, hard field, an important field of social work. And many people have learned to build their own lives well and look after their own families well by looking at what happens in social work when they deal with. So doing social work to somebody else actually has helped social workers to build their own families in their own way. Now let me look at a couple of more slides. As I think this slide has basically something which I've been harping right from the beginning. Exposing children to the domestic violence is in itself an abuse. It constitutes an abuse. And I think this is where the entire conversation before has always told us this is how the intergenerational domestic violence may even be taking some of its roots from. So children do not passively observe violence at home. I think that's the idea in this slide. They actually see it, actively experience it, sense it, feel it. In those pictures that you've seen some time back, when I use dogs, when I use cats, when I use even horses, you saw they were all sad. They could hear that there is violence happening. They could see, and what do? They move away. They experience that. They experience abusive environment. Sometimes parents used to tell me, we may be violent to each other, but I can tell you, Tom never hurt his children. or Jill never hurt her child, and Tom didn't even, hurt my ex-partner's children. Now, that's a crazy way of talking about it. I kind of think it's a very silly notion to uphold that anyway children are not affected just because Tom is not hurting or Jill is not hurting. They are hurt. They are hurt by the fact that Jill and Tom are not working out their relationship. So it's important for us to consider that and try to tell the parents that we are talking to them, look, children's psyche is different. Of course, we don't denigrate parents, but we do have a rule, we do have a role to tell them children suffer your lack of communication. And that is an important thing that we need to understand. Yes, that's what it is. If parents come and say, no, he doesn't beat children, that isn't a sound argument. His yelling, screaming, and abusive partner is possibly just enough. So it's important here for us to also think about how do we intervene and increase respect to any single presenting issue. Let's say child maltreatment. What do we deal with the other co-concerning issues that come up, co-occurring concerns, substance abuse, mental health, various other kinds of issues that might even be there. What is the way through which we work our protocols, pathways between different organizations? How do we work with the stakeholders between different government departments? What is the information that we start gaining as a result of understanding, as a result of our communication to the other departments? All these things also become very, very important in this particular business of working social work, bringing social work into domestic violence and that of child protection.